What if I told you that there was actually a Nazi who said sorry? Some of you who have read up a lot on the history in World War II may know this already, but most of you probably don't, and so I'm going to just put this guy's story out there. There was one of the leading Nazis who was not a raging lunatic or fanatic. Hitler being a raging lunatic, a frothing fanatic such as Goebbels, or a big fat ego like Goering. Amongst these leading Nazis sat Hitler's armaments minister, Albert Speer. And Speer was the more rational of the Nazis. Goebbels could be rational, but Speer dealt with numbers and dealt with production figures all day, every day. And he joined the Nazi Party as it was coming to power and as soon as it became evident that Hitler would come to power. He was not one of the early Nazis. He was not part of the Beer Hall Putsch or any of the other things in 1922. But he did join the Nazi Party in the 1930s, just as Hitler became chancellor and just as he became part of power. And Speer joined for one reason, and that's because he was an architect by trade. And so therefore, he wanted to join for the big projects that being part of government would eventually allow him to build. Hitler liked the guy, even though he was not a frothing, deadpan loyalist. And the reason why is because Speer got results. When he was Minister of Armaments in the early 1940s, talk about the years 1941 and 1942, he performed what was then known as the armaments miracle, where the Germans were absolutely getting their butts handed to them in the armaments race. And he was able to multiple fold production of things like planes, ammunition, tanks, and the like. And it was basically considered a stone cold miracle. And the reason why Hitler liked this man is because he got results. Speer was not some fanatical, anti-Semite. He was there because he loved to build things, and he loved to be part of projects, and he dealt in logistics before logistics were even cool. Unfortunately for Speer, he got a report in 1944. The German intelligence had brought to him about American military production, and the numbers were just outright shocking. The United States was able to outbuild the entire Axis alliance in tanks, planes, ammunition, even submarines. As famous as the Nazi U-boats were, by this point the Americans were outproducing them even in that category. But being outbuilding, in planes, bombers, by like a 20-1 margin, outbuilding Germany by that point. Speer read this report in 1944 that spoke of an American factory called Willow Run, which was in Michigan outside of Detroit. And a new B-52 bomber was able to come off this assembly line once every 63 minutes at the height of production in 1944. And he looked at this report and he immediately knew the last bullets will not be fired for quite some time. But at this point, the war was already lost. In 1944, a little over a year before the actual end of the war in Europe. Now, Speer would eventually be tried at Nuremberg in 1946. And his interrogators asked him, why didn't he tell Hitler this? Or why didn't he try to stop the war knowing that they couldn't win? and his answer was brutally cold and honest. Speer told his British and American interrogators that it would have resulted in his assassination, and knowing Hitler's attitude towards any negative information, which he labeled as defeatism, this was almost 100% likely to be completely true. And so at Nuremberg, at the trial in 1946, after the war was over, he did apologize for what he had done. He apologized for not taking steps to end the war before it did. And he also expressed that Hitler had a Nero decree back in 1944 that Germany did not deserve to survive the war. They did not deserve any type of a life because they had failed him. I talked about Kip McKean, cult leader, being a narcissist. Well, Hitler was Kip McKean times about 5. That the fact that the country lost the war, mainly because of his own terrible decisions, by the way. Might I explain the 1942 invasion of the Soviet Union and the Battle of Stalingrad being first and foremost amongst that list. And of course, as I've said in a previous episode, his declaration of war on the United States in 1941 was the worst of the bunch. But nonetheless, Hitler believed that the German nation had let him down, and they were not worthy of having any type of a reasonable standard of life after the war, and so he published what he called his Nero decree, which means to burn it all down. To burn the entire German nation's infrastructure down because they had failed him. Problem was, for Hitler, was Speer was still in charge of the infrastructure of the Reich. And he very quietly refused to obey this order of Hitler's. He refused to tear down German infrastructure as Hitler demanded. And he eventually did tell him in the last month of 1945, on his last visit to the Führer bunker in April of 1945, that he did indeed refuse this decree. Hitler didn't go on one of his usual rants at this point. Hitler looked at him just with a real, almost fatherly look of disappointment. Now, Speer, of course, lived to tell the tale after all of this, and hence in 1946, he became known as the Nazi who said he was sorry. Because he expressed that he was basically following orders, a defense which, of course, with the evidence that was mounted against the Nazis, couldn't stand that type of scrutiny. And so, but Speer did apologize basically for everything that he did. Now, at the Nuremberg trial, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity and was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. That's going to be another episode, by the way. But Speer did 20 years in Spandau prison for crimes against humanity. And specifically why it was crimes against humanity in his case, specifically how he was convicted, he clearly didn't order any of the killings of the Nazis. He didn't order any of the mass exterminations. But unfortunately, what he did do in this regards to armaments production was he used slave labor and concentration camp labor. That's where they got him. He was not Himmler. He was not ordering sending them to concentration camps and ordering them. But he was unfortunately using those individuals for labor in terms of, slave labor, in terms of creating armaments and building weapons. So, in that regard, that's how they found him guilty. He eventually did write, books about his experiences as armaments minister and as a member of Hitler's inner circle. Now, in the period before the trial, but after the fall of the Reich in May of 1945, he had a brief role. I had an episode previously with the last leader of Nazi Germany, Karl Dönitz. Dönitz formed basically a pseudo-government in the north of Germany near the Danish border in a town called Flensburg. The only member of Hitler's direct inner circle who Dönitz brought on board for his government was Albert Speer. He basically held the same title in this very short-lived government, which lasted only 3 weeks, by the way. The British and Soviets had finally decided this farce had gone long enough, and so they put an end to it and went to Flensburg. The British arrested him on May of 23rd of 1945, along with Dönitz. So Speer and Dönitz were actually arrested and taken into captivity and interrogation together. Dönitz, of course, being the commander of the Navy prior to the fall, and Speer being the Minister of Armaments and having a similar position in the Flensburg government. But the farce finally came to an end 3 weeks after. Actually, it wasn't even 3 weeks. It was a little bit more like 2.5. Between May 8th and May 23rd of 1945. That's how long the Flensburg government lasted. The Flensburg government, of course, was created because of Hitler's last will and testament, and he appointed Dönitz his successor. And Dönitz was already in the north of Germany, being the commander of the Navy, and was situated in the naval port at Flensburg. And that's how this government was founded. Had no real control beyond the borders of the town itself. There was no coherent national government remaining, but because of Hitler's will and testament, they at least were able to pretend. And Dönitz and Speer held on to the illusion and held off the advancing Soviets from reaching that part of Germany long enough to allow a couple of million of German soldiers and civilians to flee to the west and surrender to the Western Allies instead of the Soviet Union. This was Speer and Dönitz's biggest accomplishment, and one that in his book Speer would later go on to be relatively proud of. But, he did use, I was just following defense orders. Of course, the evidence ran to the contrary, as it did with most of the rest of the Nazis at Nuremberg who were being tried. But Speer, I think, did probably one of the best jobs of rehabilitating an image of anybody in such an evil situation in history. How much of it is genuine is still debated to this day. Whether he really was sorry about what he did as a Nazi, and whether he did all he could to stop the war. The part about him denying the Nero Decree is unquestionable, though. And for that one fact alone, probably deserves a teeny tiny crumb of commendation. I wouldn't call him a hero, but it did allow both sides of Germany to eventually have some sort of remaining infrastructure after the war. So he does get a crumb of credit for that much. But of course, Speer clearly knew who he was fighting for, clearly knew what he was building for, clearly knew what he was using to achieve his goals. And this is why I'm not ready to give him any medals, but he did apologize for his involvement. It did not save him at trial, although it did save him from the hangman's noose, which, unlike many, I believe it was 11 of the surviving Nazis were condemned to death, and they were hung at Nuremberg after the trial. I do believe that his contrite, while it didn't save him from prison, like I said, he spent 20 years at Spandau prison, it did save him from, I believe, the hangman's noose. Now, I could do a different piece about Spandau prison and the prisoners. I don't know off the top of my head about all 7 prisoners at that prison. Spandau was a military prison that was built in the 1890s by the original Kaiser. And it was built and initially held up to 600 wartime prisoners of war in World War I, but then was converted to its unique and most famous usage after World War II and after the Nuremberg trials, where 7 members of the senior Nazis who were not sentenced to death spent their fixed prison sentences at Spandau prison. Speer was one of those. He spent 20 years in Spandau. He did serve his entire sentence and was not let out early. He didn't have any medical concerns, unlike some of the others. So they were able to keep him in prison for the entire time. He wrote those books in Spandau prison, which went a long way towards rehabilitating his image after the war. And again, it's very well debated how much of it he really meant. Albert Speer did pass away in 1980. He was released from Spandau in 1966. So he didn't have many years outside of prison, but he did have a heck of a run with his books in the years between 1966 and 1980. 1980, of course, is also the same year that Karl Dönitz passed away, the last leader of Nazi Germany with the Flensburg government under which Speer served. What these men were capable of doing with no national government and no national real jurisdiction after Hitler's passing was very minimal at best, but they saved some German soldiers and a handful of civilians in the process. I believe Speer was intoxicated by power. His motivation for becoming a part of the Nazi Party with the goal of being an architect and building major projects. He started out legitimate, but eventually ended up being one of the enablers of Adolf Hitler and his tremendous criminal deeds. But he did eventually apologize for his criminal deeds, and this had an interesting impact on his prison life. Speer was not liked by really anybody else in Spandau prison because he apologized for what he had done. This apology got him the disdain of the other 6 prisoners. He was generally loathed by everybody. And that includes Dönitz, who he had served under. Dönitz, of course, never apologized for his role in the Third Reich. And he wrote books about, his naval command. And so there it is, guys. The Nazi who said sorry. I'm going to announce right now what another person I'm going to cover from that same time frame, and that's going to be the general who surrendered Berlin. So come back tomorrow. If you like these little bits of history and my little side rants about my previous channel life here, please like and subscribe. If there's anybody else from that period that you feel like I should cover, feel free to drop a comment below. I appreciate the handful of you who've watched. I will see you tomorrow. Speaking of wars, tomorrow's Veterans Day. I'm very thankful to those who have fought to defend our freedoms, including those who did fight for us in World War II. I know we don't have very many of those veterans surviving left. I don't think we have any of them surviving left. I'll have to take a look. I'll get back to y'all tomorrow. But anyway, you folks have a great rest of your night. Peace out, homies.